The beginning of the Sumerians. The world still had no names, no borders, no dates to be remembered. There was only the flat, silent land, heavy with moisture, between two colossal bodies of water that overflowed with violence and, as they receded, left behind a new skin made of silt, of sediment, and of possibilities. That land without history was the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, a place where mud was not filth, but the raw material of the future. There, more than 6,000 years ago, before empires, armies, cities, or even the idea of a calendar existed, the beating heart of the first human civilization began to take shape, slowly and inevitably: the Sumerians. The men who arrived in those lands did not come from a single direction, nor did they belong to a single culture. They were nomads who followed the rhythm of the animals, hunters who looked for a place to stay when there were no more beasts to pursue. Others came down from the Zagros or the northern hills, pushed by droughts, climate changes, or simple accidents of life. All of them found something in that muddy landscape that made them stop. It was not a glorious act or a conscious decision. It was the intuition that this land could yield bread if wounded with a tool, and watered with the untamable rivers. For centuries, perhaps millennia, the only things built there were reed huts, small fences, and hardened mud wells. But the true construction was invisible. Human bonds, the first shared words, ideas that began to be transmitted not through gestures, but through symbols. In that silent beginning, something changed forever. Wheat was domesticated, barley was stored, animals were confined, and the land was given a name. And with that, human time began. The Sumerians, who would later be known by that name, did not call themselves that. Their name for their own people was something else: the people of the black heads. And the territory where they lived, they called Kiengir. This mysterious term has an uncertain translation, but it may evoke something like the land of the civilized lords. Even though that civilization still had no palaces, no laws, no recognizable kings, what was being born was much deeper than architecture. It was the birth of a new way of being human, one that would no longer depend on nature, but would begin to rewrite it. The landscape where the Sumerians emerged was a permanent paradox. Before them lay fertile but unpredictable land, two rivers that gave life and, at the same time, took it away with violent floods. There were no strong trees, no stones, no metals at hand. Only mud. Mud as far as the eye could see. Mud in the walls, mud in the streets, mud in the graves. And yet, with that mud, they built everything. As if the biblical myth of Adam had Sumerian roots, it was from the damp dust of that land that temples, canals, records, villages, and later cities rose. The key to their survival, and later to their greatness, was water. But not just any water. It was the art of controlling it, of taming it without extinguishing its fury. They learned to dig canals, to build dikes, to measure the rain, to read the color of the sky. They knew when the flood would come and how to divert the river before it destroyed their crops. They did not use magical formulas, although their gods were always present. They did it with observation, with patience, with trial and error. Hydraulic engineering was their first science, and with it was born a form of power that did not depend on force, but on knowledge. The first settlements began to emerge on the safest edges, where the water did not sweep everything away, but was still sufficient to cultivate. And thus appeared names that now barely echo, but that were the entire universe to those who inhabited them: Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Uruk. Small human centers surrounded by an as-yet untamed vastness. But on that map of mud, the outline of the city began to take shape: the temple, the plaza, the market. None of that had existed before. None of it arose in a single day. In the earliest villages, authority did not yet have a defined face. There were no kings or warriors, but elders, priests, community leaders who made decisions by consensus or by tradition. But as the water demanded management, as work was divided, and as harvests exceeded the needs of a single family, the need to record also emerged. And with the need came the tool. From the marks on clay tablets, originally meant only to count sacks of grain or heads of livestock, was born the seed of writing. The act of recording became sacred, and the scribes, the first wise men of the world. Nothing in the birth of the Sumerians was fast. Each stage lasted for centuries, as if history were in no hurry. The city, as we know it, did not appear right away. It was a cumulative process, where religion, economy, climate, and custom wove the fabric of urban life. Villages became ceremonial centers, and those centers grew into administrative hubs. The temple ceased to be a simple altar and became the most powerful institution. In its courtyards, grain was stored, resources were distributed, and labor was organized. The city revolved around the temple like planets around the sun. The Sumerians did not merely invent a way of life. They invented the very possibility of living together, organized, obeying rules, leaders, gods who were no longer from the forest or the thunder, but who had names, families, roles, and a fixed residence in the great ziggurats that rose like artificial mountains on the flat horizon. That was something completely new. For the first time, the human being saw himself not as part of the landscape, but as its author. History does not remember the names of the first Sumerians. We do not know what the men were called who dug the first canals, nor the women who ground the grain with rough stones while their children ran barefoot through the mud. But without them, without their anonymous effort, without their ability to stay and adapt, there would be no empires, no laws, no calendars, and no us. Because somewhere in that vast clay delta, the impulse was born that forever separated us from the wild world. The desire to remain, to leave a mark, to make history. And so, when mankind emerged from the mud, it was not only in the physical sense. They emerged from a previous state of existence. They left behind blind dependence on the environment and entered a stage where humanity could modify nature. They began to domesticate not only animals or plants, but also ideas, and that was, perhaps, the deepest domestication of all. In the next chapter, we will travel to the remains of the city that the Sumerians themselves called the first of all, Eridu, a place shrouded in myth, where the ruins speak not only of stone and clay, but of a worldview that believed civilization descended from the sky to begin there. Because when men rose from the mud, Eridu was their first beacon. Eridu and the first urban whisper. In the far south of Mesopotamia, where the land begins to blur with the waters of the Persian Gulf and the horizon flattens until it disappears, there was once a city that breathed before all others. It was not a bustling metropolis nor a capital filled with columns and walls. It was more like a germinal idea, an ancient nucleus wrapped in mists of myth and silence, which the Sumerians themselves remembered as the place where civilization descended from the sky. That place was called Eridu. Eridu was not the largest, nor the most powerful, nor the longest lasting. However, there is something about it that makes it unique. It was the first. At least, that is what the Sumerians claimed, and that is what archaeology seems to whisper when its cracked soil is excavated. There, in overlapping layers of history, lie traces of an occupation that dates back almost 6,000 years before our era. We are no longer speaking of simple agricultural societies, but of something more structured, more conscious. In Eridu, human beings began to imagine the city not as a collection of huts, but as an organism with a heart, with purpose, with a soul. The city of Eridu was built on difficult terrain, at the edge of the marshes, surrounded by natural canals and subject to the whims of the Euphrates River. But that very difficulty sharpened the senses and the hands. Here, it was not enough to farm and hunt. Here, it was necessary to organize, to plan, to foresee. The extreme climate, the sudden floods, and the scarcity of solid resources such as stone or wood forced a fierce creativity. What they had was mud, reeds, shells, and a collective memory that was beginning to turn into tradition. At the center of it all stood the temple. It was not yet a ziggurat, nor did it have the size of the great constructions that would come later, but its presence dominated the landscape. In the oldest base of the temple of Eridu, which was rebuilt at least 20 times in the same location, one layer upon another, lies one of the oldest examples of planned sacred architecture. It was not just a building. It was a point of contact between earth and sky, a symbolic axis from which community life was organized. That first sanctuary was dedicated to the god Enki, lord of the underground waters, of wisdom, and of the arts. Enki was not a distant god. He was believed to literally dwell there, in the temple. His earthly abode was that small mud structure, perfumed with incense, decorated with shells brought from the sea and ritual offerings. From a religious point of view, Eridu was the beginning of time. The oldest Sumerian texts that refer to its myths make this very clear. It was in Eridu that the gods delivered the me, the divine decrees that governed civilization. Among those decrees were kingship, writing, music, architecture, and even ritual lamentation. Everything that allows a culture to exist, according to the Sumerians, was granted there. Not in Nippur, nor in Ur, not even in future Babylon. Everything began in Eridu. The construction of the temple was neither an isolated nor a spontaneous act. It was a collective enterprise, probably guided by a religious authority and carried out by hands that already understood the value of repetition, of technique, of symmetry. The city was born around the temple like a whirlpool of modest houses, organized around central courtyards, connected by dirt paths that followed the flow of people, not of armies. Unlike what would happen centuries later with walled cities, Eridu grew as an extension of the temple outward, like an urban offering to the god who resided at its core. Archaeologists have discovered structures there that show a surprising cultural continuity. From the Ubaid period, which dates back to the middle of the 6th millennium before our era, to the Uruk period, Eridu remained a spiritual center of reference. Although its political power was eventually overshadowed by more ambitious cities, its symbolic importance never completely disappeared. Even when Eridu was little more than a shadow, its name continued to be mentioned on tablets as the place where it had all begun. The city also played a role in the shaping of the first concepts of centralization. The temple was not only a place of worship, but a true economic center. Surpluses were stored there, grain was distributed, and communal labor was organized. That primitive structure is, in many ways, the embryo of what would later become the state. The city as a system, not just a collection of houses. The temple as a brain, not just an altar. Living in Eridu meant a daily bond with the sacred. Daily tasks, from collecting water to kneading bread, were permeated by the invisible but constant presence of Enki. Rituals, songs, gestures, even silences, were part of a liturgy that structured time. And when night fell over the canals and the flat rooftops, the moon's reflection on the water transformed the city into a strange, almost mystical vision, as if the visible world were merely a faint copy of another one, deeper and more real. For centuries, Eridu was a point of reference, even for those who no longer lived there. The most powerful cities claimed their legitimacy in part due to their connection with Eridu. It was the origin, and like all origins, it held a power that surpassed the tangible. Even though temples grew in other regions, even though gods changed their accents and dialects evolved, the echo of Eridu never completely faded. And yet, its fall was as silent as its rise. The city was not destroyed by enemies nor consumed by fire. It was abandoned, slowly, perhaps due to the river's retreat, the advance of the marshes, or a climatic change that altered the rainfall patterns. What is certain is that Eridu was covered by sand, forgotten by generations, until the 20th century rediscovered it beneath layers of unnamed history. Today, what remains of Eridu are mounds of earth, fragments of pottery, and the persistent feeling that there, among the cracks of the dry soil, something is still beating. An urban whisper, yes, but also a cosmic murmur. As if the first unwritten words, the first intentions of forming a city, of organizing life, and of looking at the sky from a fixed point, had not yet finished being spoken. With Eridu, we understand that the city is not merely a physical construction, but a spiritual act, a tacit agreement between humans and gods, between nature and will, a way of being together that is born from the desire to understand the world through symbols, rituals, and structures. And for that reason, every city that came after was, in a way, a replica of Eridu, a city with memory, with a center, with a soul. Now we will delve into that invisible dimension that made the organization of all Sumerian life possible. The universe of their gods, beings as powerful as they were temperamental, who shaped destiny from higher planes and walked among humans with masks of wind and mud. Because without the gods, Eridu would have been nothing more than a settlement. And with them, it became the beginning of the world. A world ruled by visible gods. In Sumerian Mesopotamia, where the river marked the seasons and the mud raised temples, there was no dividing line between the visible and the invisible. Everything was blended together. The human and the divine coexisted in the same layer of reality. History did not begin with people, but with gods who had already lived, fought, loved, and decreed the course of the cosmos long before the first Sumerian lit a fire to bake his bread. This was not a distant or symbolic mythology. It was the very structure of existence. In that world, the gods were as real as rain and drought, as present as the mud that covered the feet every morning. Each Sumerian city had its own patron god, a deity who not only protected the place but resided in its main temple, in its most sacred sanctuary, and who demanded devotion, offerings, rituals, songs, constant care. It was not a matter of believing in the gods, but of living with them. They were there. They breathed in the walls of the temples, spoke through omens, made decisions on the tablets that the priests interpreted with infinite attention. And most importantly, they intervened. They were not distant and indifferent deities. They were rulers with absolute power. The Sumerian pantheon was not a rigid structure, but it did have clear hierarchies. At the top stood Enlil, the lord of the wind, the authoritarian father, the one who could grant kingdoms or destroy them with a single breath. Enlil did not ask for permission nor offer explanations. When his will was imposed, even the other gods obeyed. His dwelling, the Ekur temple of Nippur, was the spiritual heart of the Sumerian world, and although other cities competed for political or economic power, none dared to ignore the decrees that came from there. Very close was An, or Anu, the god of the sky, a more remote figure, less active, but immensely respected. He was the beginning of everything, the father of the gods, the cosmic framework. Even though he was not the protagonist of the stories, his presence was felt as a force that contained the rest of the universe. Next came Enki, the god of wisdom, of underground waters, of art, of language, of useful inventions. Enki did not impose through violence, but through intelligence. He was the one who helped humans when the other gods became cruel or capricious. He lived in Eridu, and from his temple he ruled the aquatic abysses, but also dreams, music, and knowledge. If Enlil was the whip, Enki was the compass. And then there was Inanna, the great lady of the sky, the most fascinating, the most complex, the one who could love with fury and kill with desire. Goddess of love, war, sex, and power, Inanna was not a decorative figure nor a sweetened symbol of fertility. She was dangerous, unpredictable, and absolutely central to Sumerian spiritual life. Her temple in Uruk was one of the most active and ornate, and during her festivals, the entire city was transformed. Each god had their function, their story, their specific relationship with humans. But they also had their own will, conflicts among themselves, human emotions amplified by eternity. The Sumerian tablets are full of stories where the gods confront each other, fall in love, seek revenge, mock and punish. Because the Sumerian gods were not perfect, they were powerful, yes, but also temperamental, proud, contradictory. And that is precisely why they felt so close. In daily life, the gods were not an abstraction. They were present in every important decision, in every construction, in every harvest, in every birth. Houses had small altars. Temples, besides being religious centers, were economic, political, and social hubs. There, goods were administered, food was distributed, disputes were resolved. Priests were not symbolic intermediaries. They were the officials of the gods. The temple functioned as the seat of city government, but not under human command, rather under the will of the local deity. The relationship between the Sumerians and their gods was a mixture of fear, respect, gratitude, and obligation. It was not about worshiping in order to be loved, but about fulfilling a cosmic function. According to the myths, humans had been created to work in place of the gods, to maintain their temples, to sing their hymns, to plow the land that belonged to them. The world belonged to the gods. Humans were there to make it function, and yet there was room for devotion, for mysticism, for beauty. The Sumerian hymns, preserved carved in clay tablets, are pure poetry. They speak of the light of Inanna, the roar of Enlil, the perfume rising from the altars, the tears of the faithful seeking comfort or forgiveness. In many of those texts, there is a profound recognition of human suffering, of uncertainty in the face of death, of the fear of illness, of the desire to find meaning in chaos. And there, among ancient verses, appears a humanity that resembles our own. But if there is something that distinguishes the Sumerian religious universe from many later traditions, it is its absence of heavenly promises. The Sumerians did not worship their gods in the hope of eternal reward. There was no paradise, no final redemption. The afterlife was a gloomy existence in the underworld, a sort of colorless echo. That is why everything important had to happen here, in this life, in this city, under this divine law. The temple was the center of the world, the place where cosmic order could be upheld, even if the universe was full of threats. The visible gods did not only reign from above, they also manifested in kings who claimed to receive their mandates, in priestesses who embodied their voice, in natural phenomena interpreted as warnings. An eclipse, an out-of-season storm, a plague in the fields. These were seen as signs that something was being done wrong, that the balance had been broken. Everything had meaning, even if it was not immediately understood. And that meaning, that constant search to decipher the divine will, was what moved the entire people. This religiosity permeated every sphere of existence, from the harshest laws to lullabies, from agricultural techniques to state ceremonies. Nothing was disconnected from the sacred. In a way, living in Sumer was living within a constantly written mythological tale, where each gesture could have eternal consequences. And so, While the cities grew and diversified, while languages evolved and writing systems improved, the gods remained. They changed faces, merged with foreign gods, adopted new symbols, but the principle remained the same. The world functioned because the gods sustained it. And when those gods spoke, they did so with a voice of thunder, with wind that swept the fields, or with absolute silence. But always, always, they were visible. Sumerian civilization advanced under this constant gaze. In its architecture, in its politics, in its poetry and its pain, the gods were inscribed as part of the landscape. There was no space without them, and each city was an extension of its temple, one more room inside the house of the sacred. Now that we have felt the breath of the gods, it is fitting to pause and observe the next step in this astonishing story. The need to bring order to time, to measure the days and the skies, to find in the movement of the stars a signal that allows human beings to organize their world with the same precision that the gods used to organize theirs. Because if the universe was governed by divine laws, then it must be possible to discover them and write them down. The daytime was invented. At some point during that gray eternity where the sky and the mud became indistinguishable, the Sumerians lifted their eyes. And when they looked upward, they did not just see stars or wandering lights. They saw patterns, they saw cycles, they saw repetition. In the midst of the world's chaos, where rivers could destroy in a single night the work of an entire year, and where harvests depended on signals as fragile as the moisture in the wind, finding order was much more than a desire. It was a vital necessity. And thus, time was born. Not as something abstract or philosophical, but as a concrete tool for survival, for planning, for understanding. The Sumerians were the first to carve time into stone and clay. They did so without clocks, without telescopes, without modern mathematical formulas. They did it with attentive eyes, infinite patience, and one conviction: that the universe had rules, and that deciphering them was a way of approaching the gods. In their thinking, everything had a proper moment: planting, harvesting, building, worshiping. Not everything could be done on just any day. There were favorable days and dark days, moments to open doors and moments to close them. All of that demanded a measure, a guide, a calendar. The lunar cycle was their first ally. The phases of the moon, visible and consistent, offered a regular structure that served as the backbone of Sumerian time. They divided the year into 12 lunar months, and to adjust the differences with the solar year, because they knew that the calendar would fall out of sync with the passing of the seasons. They periodically added an extra month. That required constant observation, astronomical knowledge, and a surprising organizational capacity for a culture that was still carving its history into wet tablets. But the true stroke of genius came when they looked beyond the month. The day, as a unit of time, of course already existed in practice, since sunrise and sunset were impossible to ignore. However, the Sumerians wanted to go further. They decided to divide the day into equal parts, into fragments that could be counted and synchronized. This is how the sexagesimal system was born. A system that does not follow the decimal logic we use in almost everything else, but instead is based on the number 60. Why 60? Because it is a generous number. It can be divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is a number that adapts, that obeys. And the Sumerians, obsessed with order, with cycles and proportions, adopted it as a fundamental measure. Thanks to that system, the hour with 60 minutes was born, the minute with 60 seconds, and a way of counting that still accompanies us today every time we look at a clock. But this discovery was not an isolated act of genius. It was part of a culture that was training itself to observe with precision, to record, to anticipate. The Sumerian priest astronomers climbed to the highest rooftops, sat on observation platforms, and followed, night after night, the movements of the sky. They identified constellations, noted the behavior of stars, and related those movements to phenomena on Earth. And thus, slowly, time began to have structure, meaning, direction. The agricultural calendar, for example, was a functional work of art. Based on celestial and climatic cycles, it dictated when the land should be plowed, when the barley should be sown, when the grain should be harvested, and when sacrifices should be offered. Religious festivals were not placed at random. Each one corresponded to a specific moment in that great cosmic gear. Honoring the gods on the wrong day could bring chaos. Doing so on the correct day could ensure a year of prosperity. Time also became a political tool. Whoever controlled the calendar controlled the rhythm of collective life. Establishing workdays, sacred days, cycles of taxation or food distribution was not just an organizational matter. It was an act of power. That is why the temple was not only the place of worship, but also the center, where astronomical tables and calendrical records were produced. In this way, time became part of governance. But not everything was practical or technical. The Sumerians, deeply sensitive to symbolism, saw something sacred in time. Every number had a mystical value, every cycle a correspondence with the rhythms of the body and soul. The year was not only a journey through the seasons, it was a spiritual voyage. The month was not just another moon in the sky. It was a mirror of the feminine cycle, of inner rhythms, of the deaths and rebirths that occur without the body changing places. In their poems, time appears as an ambiguous creature, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel. There are tablets that describe the passage of time as a river that sweeps away everything, even the memory of heroes. But there are also texts that celebrate it, that invoke it, that revere it as one more god. Because without time, everything would be suspended. And in a culture that built its identity on the repetition of cycles, time was the very fabric of life. The invention of time as we understand it today cannot be separated from its writing. The cuneiform tablets were not used only to count livestock or register tributes. They also contained astronomical notes, lists of auspicious days, seasonal prophecies. Time was documented, measured, classified, and in that process, it became history. Because while earlier civilizations could remember the past through orally transmitted stories, the Sumerians could date it, give it a number, locate it. And by doing so, they broke through the foggy linearity of myth and began to construct an organized narrative of the world. Today, when we look at a clock or count the days until an event, we are repeating a Sumerian gesture. When we celebrate the beginning of the year or mark an important date on a calendar, we are participating, whether we know it or not, in that same tradition begun more than 5,000 years ago, when a group of wise people in the Mesopotamian plain decided that the chaos of the sky could have form, and that this form could be written down. It is almost ironic to think that it was they, with their clay tablets and their eyes fixed on the stars, who taught us not to get lost in the immensity of time. They gave us scales, units, rhythms. They taught us that time is not just what passes, but what can be understood, celebrated, feared, and harnessed. And deep down, inventing time was an act of rebellion against uncertainty, a way of planting a flag in front of the abyss, of saying, here begins a day, here it ends. Here a new cycle begins. Here I can measure my life and perhaps give it meaning. Now that we understand how time became a human tool, we can look with new eyes at the most revolutionary invention of the Sumerians, writing. Because measuring time was only the first step in organizing the world. The next step was to record everything that happened within that world, and leave it written so that it could never be forgotten. The clay that learned to speak. In the endless plain where rivers left their thick silt and men built cities with their own hands, there came a day, perhaps without anyone realizing it at the time, when memory no longer depended on breath. From that moment on, it was no longer necessary to repeat words over and over again to keep them from being lost across generations. Something new had emerged, something silent but more lasting than the voice, more solid than oral tradition, writing. And in the case of the Sumerians, it did not arise from stone or paper, but from clay, literally from clay. That baked clay, molded and carved with reed styluses, was the medium through which a civilization first managed to fix its thoughts, its records, its names, its prayers, and its laws. It was not the result of a spontaneous act of genius, nor an invention that happened in a single day. It was the outcome of a growing need that had been building for centuries. The world had become too complex to entrust everything to memory alone. As the Sumerian cities grew, as temples concentrated wealth, as canals distributed water according to increasingly sophisticated plans, a simple yet urgent problem arose: how to remember everything. How could they ensure that the grain delivered by a farmer in the spring was the same grain the temple owed him at the end of the agricultural cycle? How could they know how many sheep an official had received, or which plot of land had been assigned to which family? The economy, state control, justice. These newly born mechanisms required a more stable form of memory than human recollection. And thus began the history of writing. At first, it was merely a set of basic marks, carved into wet tablets with reed styluses, simple symbols representing objects: a barley spike, a sheep, a jug. Each pictogram was an idea. But over time, these marks evolved, becoming more refined, more nuanced. Scribes discovered that they could represent not only things, but sounds, that they could combine signs to form names, actions, and thoughts. It was then that clay learned to speak. This writing system was called cuneiform by modern archaeologists due to the wedge-shaped appearance of its signs. But for the Sumerians, it was simply the language of the gods made tangible. Writing was seen as a sacred gift, a tool granted to humans so they could fulfill their role with precision and communicate with higher beings. It was not just a technique, it was a form of cosmic order. The oldest tablets we have preserved are over 5,000 years old and come mostly from Uruk, a city that at that time was experiencing unprecedented demographic and administrative growth. There, scribes worked day and night in temple courtyards, recording transactions, marking inventories, noting offerings, drawing endless lists of products and names. What began as accounting eventually became literature, law, hymns, and prayers. The written word freed itself from administration and began to explore the soul. Learning to write was a privilege reserved for a few. Sumerian scribes spent years in training, in what we could call the world's first schools. These houses of knowledge were called Eduba, literally, the house of tablets. There, apprentices copied the same phrases, the same exercises, over and over again, until they mastered not only the signs but also the grammar, syntax, and logic of the cuneiform system. It was not an easy education, nor a brief one, but those who completed the path were considered wise men, intermediaries between the human and the divine. The figure of the scribe held a central place in society. He was not just an official, he was the custodian of truth, the guardian of the archives, the only one who could interpret the king's decrees, the words of the gods, the treaties between cities. Nothing could be done without his reed pen. And if one day he disappeared, so did the record of the debt, the crime, the will. To write was to wield power. Cuneiform tablets hardened when dried in the sun or when baked in kilns, and many of them have come down to us thanks precisely to the fragility that turned into strength. When a city was burned, when archives fell under fire, the tablets were accidentally baked, preserved for millennia, as if they had been made to resist eternity. That is why today we can read in exact detail how contracts were signed, how justice was administered, what a king ate at his banquet, or what punishment was given to someone who stole an ox. But writing was not used solely for control. It was also a mirror of imagination. The epics, the myths, the religious hymns, the lamentations over war, the personal prayers. All of that was also inscribed in clay. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works of humanity, was written in cuneiform. And although its most famous version reached us through the Akkadians, its roots are clearly in Sumer. In its verses, we find adventure, death, the search for meaning, and the desire to transcend. It is, in a way, the oldest voice we can still hear without intermediaries. It is astonishing to think that all that cultural richness, all that symbolic universe, was born from a need as simple as counting sacks of grain. And yet, that is how it happened. Writing was invented to solve a practical problem, but once the door was opened, an entire world emerged. The everyday gave way to the sacred. What was countable became art, and it all happened on clay. Today, when we speak, when we write, when we leave a note or sign a contract, we are repeating an ancestral gesture. We still believe in the power of words to fix realities, to bear witness, to communicate with those who are not present. That impulse, that desire for the voice to outlive the throat that utters it, was what gave birth to writing. And although cuneiform stopped being used centuries ago, its echo still resonates within us. Every letter we learn, every story we remember, every record we preserve, descends from that foundational moment when a civilization decided that forgetting could no longer be the natural fate of things. Now that clay has learned to speak, it is time to listen to the cities that flourished because of it. Because there was one city in particular that brought writing, power, art, and religion to a scale never before seen. A city that would change the course of Sumerian history and give the world one of its first great heroes. Its name was Uruk, and its story deserves to be told with the same intensity with which it was lived. Uruk and the roar of the first great city. In the depths of southern Mesopotamia, when the rivers were still untamed and the small cities seemed like mere sprouts of mud upon the landscape, there arose a city that changed the rhythm of the world. Its name was Uruk, and its presence was not imposed by the force of a military empire nor by the luxuries of gold, but by something far more impactful: the power of organization, the magnitude of its architecture, and the spiritual echo that resonated from its temples. Uruk was not simply one city among many. It was, in the full sense of the word, the first great city in history. Nothing in Uruk was discreet. Unlike earlier settlements, which seemed to adapt humbly to the natural environment, Uruk rose as a statement, as a bold declaration that the human being no longer merely lived upon the earth. Now, they transformed it. There, for the first time, mud ceased to be just shelter and became monument. The constructions were no longer merely functional refuges. They were structures that spoke, that conveyed power, belief, and order. During its period of greatest splendor, Uruk reached over 50,000 inhabitants, an astonishing figure for its time. It was a living, expansive, vibrant city, crossed by canals that served as liquid streets, with entire neighborhoods dedicated to specific trades, and temples that dominated the horizon like beacons of a new era. It was a city designed to endure, conceived not for the immediate day-to-day, but to be inscribed in history. At the center of everything stood the temple of Inanna, goddess of fertility, of love, of power, of war. Her worship was more than religious. It was the very soul of Uruk. From its courtyards and altars, the economy was directed, agricultural production was distributed, tributes and offerings were managed. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a complex organism that extended throughout the city. Its influence had no visible borders. Inanna, the goddess who could seduce and destroy with the same gaze, personified the overflowing energy of Uruk. Her temple was the symbolic heart, but also the literal one, of the city. There, tablets were written, rituals were celebrated, decisions were made that affected thousands of people. And when night fell, the torches lit upon its terraces projected a trembling light that seemed to emerge from the heavens themselves, as if the goddess were watching over her people from the shadows. But Uruk was not only temple. It was industry, it was writing, it was technique. There, the cuneiform system was perfected, the methods of accounting records were systematized, and administrative formulas were refined. The streets of the city were full of scribes, artisans, merchants, laborers, all coordinated by a structure that seemed to anticipate modern management models. And that order did not arise by chance, but from a deep vision of the world. Everything must have its place, its function, its rhythm. The architecture of Uruk reflects that obsession with order and grandeur. Its oldest buildings already show a level of planning that defies the traditional image of early civilizations. The so-called Inanna complex, for example, is a ceremonial ensemble dedicated to Inanna that stands out not only for its size, but for its structural sophistication. Their rose walls covered with mosaics made from clay cones painted in vivid colors, forming geometric patterns of unexpected beauty. These walls, beyond serving an aesthetic purpose, fulfilled a political one. They displayed the splendor of the temple, and with it, the power of those who led it. Uruk was also a pioneer in the organization of labor. The entire city seemed to move like a perfectly calibrated machine. There were specialized workshops, centralized warehouses, residential areas differentiated by social levels. The city did not grow randomly. It grew in a planned manner. And with that growth, something new was born, an urban identity. Living in Uruk was different. It meant belonging to a model of life where the individual was subordinated to a greater structure, where the temple, the law, and the city formed a single unit. And in the midst of that bustle, of that coming and going of carts, oxen, jars, tablets, and ceremonies, emerged a figure who would pass into eternity. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, the man 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a symbol of strength, arrogance, and search. Although his story belongs to epic and myth, his memory is anchored in a real, tangible city that lived and breathed under his shadow. Gilgamesh is not just any character. He is the crystallization of a historical moment in which leaders ceased to be mere clan chiefs to become almost mythical figures. His legacy, beyond his supposed feats, speaks to us of a new kind of leadership, one that arises from the conflict between the human and the divine, between duty and desire, between mortality and the dream of transcendence. And that tension, that inner drama, could not have been born in just any place. It had to be in Uruk, the city that broke the limits of its time. While other cities were content to survive, Uruk projected the future. Its influence extended throughout the region. Its architectural style, its writing system, its political organization were replicated, adapted, revered. Uruk set a standard, established a model. It was the reference that all others looked upon with respect, with envy, with fear. And yet even Uruk would come to no decline. With the passing of centuries, its splendor began to fade. Other cities took its place, other goddesses claimed its throne. But the mark of Uruk was already engraved, not only on the tablets that mention its laws or its temples, but in the very concept of the city as a center of power, as a cultural matrix, as a political heart. To walk through the ruins of Uruk today is to face an overwhelming silence. There, where once resounded the chants of the priestesses of Inanna, where administrative and poetic texts were read for the first time. Now there is only dust, fragmented columns, remains of baked brick. But those who know how to look beyond appearances can still feel the ancient roar that burst from its depths. Because Uruk was not just another city. It was the first urban roar of humanity. And that roar, although now silenced, still vibrates in the depths of our modern cities, in our administrative systems, in our archives, in our laws. Uruk was the first mirror that showed what a city could be, what a civilization could dream of. After Uruk, the world was never the same. The idea of the urban as a spiritual, political, and economic center had been firmly established. And with it, a new balance was born, a system of power that was not built solely with force, but with symbols, with rights, with control. It is time to look more closely at how that power was organized, how authority was structured, how the king, the temple, and the people coexisted within that invisible architecture that shaped the centuries to come. Mortal kings beneath the shadow of the temples. In the early days of the Sumerian cities, when life still revolved around the temple as if it were the navel of the world, the figure of the king as we know it today did not exist. There were no golden thrones, no crowns, no royal genealogies claiming the right to rule by divine inheritance. What existed was the temple, and within the temple, a sacred authority that made decisions, organized, and distributed. The entire society functioned as an extension of worship. It was a practical theocracy, a system in which power flowed from the gods to the community through their priests, their scribes, their rituals. But the balance would not last forever. As the centuries passed and the cities grew in population, wealth, and complexity, a new figure appeared. One who no longer merely administered, but also led. A figure who, in times of crisis, assumed extraordinary responsibilities, made swift decisions, and responded to external threats with strength and determination. This figure was the Lugal, literally great man, who would eventually become the Sumerian king. His emergence was not the result of a sudden imposition, but a gradual transformation in which military, judicial, and political functions became concentrated in a single individual. The Lugal did not arise to replace the temple, but to complement it at first. He was chosen, at least in theory, by consensus from assemblies of elders and with the approval of the priests, during times when the stability of the temple was not enough to ensure the city's safety. But that temporary power, which was supposed to end once the crisis had passed, became entrenched. And when the danger was gone, the Lugal did not let go of the reins. Thus, the figure of the king ceased to be a temporary necessity and became a permanent institution. This new political power, however, could not impose itself without a solid justification. And in Sumer, justification could only come from the gods. Kings then began to appear in texts as chosen by Enlil, beloved by Inanna, appointed by the gods to restore order. They were not gods themselves, at least not at the beginning, but they were their direct representatives on earth. This close relationship between the divine and the political shaped a worldview in which the king had to answer both to the people and to the gods, although in practice, that accountability often leaned toward the side most convenient to power. The temple, which for centuries had been the absolute center of authority, began to share, and often dispute, that control with the new kings. Tensions arose, unstable balances, unspoken pacts. The temple continued managing large tracts of land, collecting tributes, organizing festivals, and setting the religious calendar. But the king commanded the armies, negotiated with other city-states, enforced his word in the courts of justice, and eventually began to build his own palaces. And here, something fascinating happens. The king did not destroy the temple. He incorporated it. Many Sumerian kings built temples in the names of the gods, restored ancient sanctuaries, financed priesthoods, and even participated actively in sacred rituals. Some even presented themselves as high priests. This strategic alliance between throne and altar solidified a power structure where the sacred and the political were intertwined seamlessly. The palace and the temple shared the city, and between them, the network that controlled the population was woven. But beneath that appearance of harmony, there was no lack of friction. Documents revealed disputes over land, tributes, and legal authority between the temple and the palace. On many occasions, the priests had to yield space to the expanding power of the king. And when kings began to construct their own monumental tombs, independent from the temple cult, they made it clear that their memory no longer depended on divine favor, but on their own greatness. One of the earliest documented examples of this evolution of royal power is found in the city of Kish, where kings like Inanna appear in dynastic lists as heroic figures, endowed with extraordinary traits. But it is in the figure of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, that this transformation reaches its greatest symbolic expression. In his epic, Gilgamesh does not only fight monsters or seek immortality, he also grapples with the burden of power, the responsibility of rule, and the dilemma of mortality. It is a profound portrait of what it meant to be a king in a time when power was not yet absolute, but was already deeply solitary. Over time, kings began to be portrayed as founders of dynasties, builders of temples, lawmakers, and conquerors. Their names appeared on seals, tablets, and ceremonial inscriptions. They began to leave their mark not only on the present, but on history. The king became the axis around which chronologies revolved. No longer was it said simply, "In such year this happened," but rather, "In the 5th year of the reign of such king, this temple was built," or "In the 3rd year after the war of such king against such city." In this way, time itself began to be organized around the royal figure. However, the clearest reminder that these kings were, in the end, human, is found underground. The royal tombs of Ur, uncovered with awe by modern archaeologists, reveal not only the wealth with which these monarchs were buried, but also the theatricality of their death. Many Sumerian kings were interred alongside their servants, their musicians, their soldiers. These were true stage sets for the afterlife, designed to recreate in the underworld the same order they had ruled on earth. But no matter the offerings, the gold, or the rituals, the bodies turned to dust. The power of the king, no matter how deified in life, could not escape human finitude. And even so, the echo of their power endured. Because the king was not an isolated figure, he was the apex of a complex pyramid, where each level was sustained by an invisible agreement between obedience and faith. His authority was, at best, a balance between force and symbol, between sword and prayer. A delicate balance, constantly redefined, marked by wars, alliances, reforms, and rebellions. The king walked beneath the shadow of the temple, but with each step, that shadow lengthened, blurred, and transformed into a crown. With the definitive establishment of royal power, Sumerian society entered a new stage of political maturity. The city-states began to confront each other not only over resources, but for prestige, territory, and dominance. Wars ceased to be mere tribal clashes and became part of the constant dynamic between cities. Power was consolidated and tested on the battlefield. And it is precisely within that dynamic where we must now direct our gaze. Because to understand Sumerian politics is not only to observe how their kings ruled, but also how they fought, how they justified their wars, how they wrote their glory and their violence into stone, into tablet, into stele. Because there is no power without conflict. And in Sumerian history, the wars between cities were as constant as the rights that pleaded for peace. To sow, to harvest, and to obey the temple. Across the vast plains of Sumer, where the horizon merged with the sky and canals traced watery arteries through silent fields, life revolved around a single ancestral act: cultivation. To sow, to care, to harvest. A rhythmic, almost liturgical sequence, uninterrupted, marking the passage of seasons and generations. But it was not merely a task for survival. It was a collective duty, a moral obligation, a task overseen by eyes that were not entirely human. In Sumer, agriculture was not just the economic engine of the city. It was an extension of the temple, an expression of cosmic order. To sow was to obey. To harvest was to be held accountable. Living off the land was, in essence, serving the gods. The temple was the true owner of the fertile land. Its power did not stem from speech, nor from armies, not even from palaces. It was born from the rigorous administration of what gave life: grain, water, livestock, and trees. Every cultivable parcel was seen as divine property, even if it was in the hands of a family that had worked it for decades. In cuneiform tablets, agricultural contracts were not mere agreements between individuals. They were concessions supervised by the temple, which granted land to peasants in exchange for labor, tribute, or seasonal service. Thus, the fields became extensions of the sanctuary, and every harvest a structured offering. The Sumerian agricultural organization was surprisingly complex. It was not made up of isolated smallholders, nor was it a chaotic subsistence farming system. The Sumerian cities, especially Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash, established a meticulous administration of agricultural production. The temple scribes kept detailed records of every sack of barley, every head of livestock, every day worked by the laborers. These tablets, many of which have survived to this day, show us an almost obsessive system of economic control. Every transaction was recorded. Every loan, every ration delivered, every offering made, was written down as part of a perfectly structured cycle. The cultivation of barley was at the center of the Sumerian diet. This resilient and adaptable grain was used to make bread and beer, the two pillars of daily nourishment. Barley was not only food, it was also a measure of value. It functioned as currency, as an accounting unit, as a symbol of abundance. Taxes were paid in barley, wages were calculated in barley, and contracts were based on its weight and quality. Even religious offerings were often made in the form of sacks of grain delivered to the temple for its use or redistribution. Irrigation was one of the fundamental tasks of the agricultural system. The canals, built and maintained under the supervision of the temple, distributed the water of the Euphrates and the Tigris to the fields. This system required coordination, oversight, and an organized workforce. Water was both a blessing and a threat. If mismanaged, the fields would flood or dry up. For that reason, its distribution was regulated with extreme precision. The tablets mention laws to prevent the illegal diversion of water, penalties for those who damaged the canals, and specific irrigation calendars assigned to different plots. Everything was controlled. Chaos had to be kept at bay. And along with the water came the labor force. The peasants were both free and dependent. There were permanent temple workers, debt slaves, tenant farmers, and laborers hired for specific seasons. Some received their pay in grain, others worked as part of ritual obligations. But all of them, in one way or another, entered the economic machinery of the temple. The work was more than physical, it was symbolic. Whoever worked the land did so under the gaze of Enlil, of Inanna, of the tutelary gods who demanded not only effort, but loyalty. The Sumerian agricultural year was marked by festivals that corresponded to key moments of the productive cycle. During sowing, protection was requested. During harvest, gratitude was offered. The ceremonies were not mere formalities. They were part of the process. It was believed that without divine intervention, the earth could close itself, the water could become corrupted, the grain could wither prematurely. That is why every step in the field was accompanied by a ritual gesture, a song, a prayer. Sowing was not a mechanical act. It was an invocation. The temple, in addition to coordinating production, functioned as a redistribution center. Agricultural products were stored in large granaries, classified by type, quantity, and destination. Part of what was collected was given to workers as wages. Another part was used to feed the priests, the temple craftsmen, the laborers who built its walls. The surplus was destined for trade, or as reserves for difficult times. This system allowed for a certain stability in an environment that could be unpredictable. Famines, although they never disappeared entirely, were mitigated by the temple's ability to foresee, store, and ration. And it is here where economy and religion fully merged. Because in Sumer, managing grain also meant managing the will of the gods. Every accounting tablet, every batch distributed, every day's wage paid, was an extension of sacred order. The scribe, with his reed stylus, was not merely writing down numbers. He was repeating a numerical liturgy that kept the cosmic balance alive. Barley was not simply a plant. It was a language. Obedience to the temple was not optional. The system did not rely on brute force, but on the deep conviction that breaking the order meant offending the gods, and therefore unleashing natural disorder. A prolonged drought, a plague, a failed crop were interpreted as clear signs that something had gone wrong, that the rules had been violated, that the tributes had not been paid, that the cycle had been altered due to a lack of devotion or precision. The guilt was collective, and the punishment shared. This sense of shared responsibility generated a discipline that today we might consider extreme, but which, in its context, had a profound logic. The city could not survive without agriculture. Agriculture could not exist without water. Water could not reach the fields without canals. Canals could not be maintained without organization. And that organization had its core in the temple. It was not merely a chain of dependency. It was a system of faith, of order, of meaning. When we observe the accounting tablets of Lagash, or the ration records in Nippur, what we see is not bureaucratic coldness. We see a civilization that understood that economy is a form of narrative, that behind every number there is a ritual, that behind every tax there is a belief, and that behind every furrow opened in the earth there is a line written in clay by invisible hands. The Sumerian economy was not the richest of its time, but it was one of the most organized, and that organization, sustained by the temple, allowed Sumer to build cities, to expand, to withstand crises, and even to export its models. Other cultures imitated their methods of distribution, of recording, of planning. Their legacy endured because their foundation was solid, because they understood that no temple can remain standing if the barley does not grow. Caravans, metals, and distant markets. While barley was being cultivated on the plains of Sumer, canals were being dug, and the gods were served with tablets, chants, and sacrifices. There was an impulse older than any calendar and stronger than any royal decree: the need to exchange, a deep desire to obtain what one's own land could not provide, to reach the value of what came from afar, to establish relationships with the unknown, and turn it into part of a system. Thus was born Sumerian trade, a network of invisible but constant routes that crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains to bring and carry materials that did not exist under the Mesopotamian sky. The wealth of Sumer was never in minerals or exotic resources. They had no vast forests, no copper mines, no mountains with precious stones. What they had was something more valuable: surplus, organization, and vision. While their fields offered barley, wool, and dates, and their temples gathered the best artisans, the Sumerians understood that these goods could serve as currency in exchange for what nature had denied them: metals, hard stones, wood, perfumes, resins. And thus, from the earliest tablets recording the arrival of seashells to the great expeditions described in royal lists, the history of trade in Sumer is also the history of its symbolic expansion. The paths of exchange were not merely commercial routes. They were cultural corridors. Along them traveled not only goods but also ideas, languages, customs, new ways of seeing the world. The caravans that departed from Ur, Lagash, or Umma, loaded with textiles, ceramics, or surplus grain, headed toward distant regions with which they shared neither religion nor language, but the same language of necessity. River trade was the backbone of the system. Taking advantage of the relative calm of the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Sumerians developed boats capable of navigating long distances while loaded with goods. These were simple boats, made from palm wood or braided reeds, sealed with bitumen, gliding slowly but securely along the rivers. From the riverine cities, goods could be shipped toward the Persian Gulf, and from there, beyond what maps could describe. One of the most coveted destinations was the mysterious land of Dilmun, which archaeologists today identify with the present-day island of Bahrain. Dilmun appears in texts as an almost mythical place, clean, prosperous, blessed by the gods, where there was no illness or aging. But behind that mythological imagery lay a commercial hub of great importance. From there, Sumer received products from the Gulf: wood, semi-precious stones, copper. Dilmun functioned as an intermediary between the Sumerians and even more distant regions. Farther east, the region of the Indus also began to echo in the Sumerian records. Contact with what we now know as the Indus Valley Civilization, especially the city of Harappa, brought with it a wave of sophisticated products: deep-toned lapis lazuli, ivory, precisely polished beads, even high-quality textiles. The tablets mention ships returning loaded with goods from Meluha, a term that many scholars associate with that distant region, whose trade routes still intrigue us. But not everything traveled by water. There were also overland caravans, organized slowly but steadily. Pack donkeys, accompanied by merchants, guards, and guides, crossed hostile regions through scorching winds and dusty horizons to reach frontier cities such as Mari on the upper Euphrates, or farther north toward Anatolia. From these lands came metals: copper, tin, even silver in smaller quantities. What Sumer lacked in its own soil, it brought from that of others. Trade was not a free and spontaneous activity. Like almost everything in Sumer, it was regulated from administrative centers, especially from the temples. It was the temple that controlled valuable goods, organized official expeditions, and set the terms of exchanges. Scribes recorded every shipment, every receipt, every exact quantity to be returned or paid. There were even commercial contracts, written on tablets with meticulous detail, that set not only the conditions of the exchange, but also the penalties for non-compliance. Over time, specialized figures emerged. The Tamkarum, a kind of official merchant or exchange agent who operated with the authority of the temple or palace and carried out transactions both within and beyond the borders. These men had to possess not only skills in calculation and logistics, but also knowledge of language, foreign values, and the dangers of the journey. In them lived the figure of the negotiator, the attentive traveler, the man who builds bridges without raising walls. And with trade came cylinder seals, small pieces engraved with images in relief, functioning as a personal signature, a symbol of authority, and a form of symbolic protection. The seal was rolled over moist clay and left its imprint as an indelible testimony. It was both a utilitarian object and a talisman. With them, sacks, doors, tablets were sealed. Through them, agreements took on material form. Commercial wealth brought with it an inevitable phenomenon: inequality. Not everyone had equal access to exotic goods or could participate in exchange. Those who controlled the routes, the warehouses, and the tablets accumulated power. The administrative and religious elite grew in influence not only because of their connection with the divine, but because of their dominance over the movement of goods. Meanwhile, artisans worked with raw materials they had never seen firsthand. The lapis lazuli they polished might have traveled hundreds of kilometers, but they only saw it turned into an amulet for a figure they would never know. And yet, that system functioned for centuries. because trade was not a mere luxury. It was a mechanism of balance. It allowed Sumer to access what it needed to maintain its rhythm, its constructions, its increasing sophistication. But it also created a network of interdependence that wove together the history of many peoples without them realizing it. To see the world from Sumer is to understand that the heart of a civilization is not sustained only by its fields or its temples, but also by its roads. Roads that are not always straight or safe, but once opened, never fully close again. Roads that carry not only objects but stories, symbols, invisible presences that embed themselves in the souls of those who receive them. When one thinks of trade in antiquity, it is easy to imagine simple bartering, exchanges between neighbors. But what the Sumerians did was something very different. They built a network, traced a mental and spiritual map of the world around them, and connected it to their own order. An earring brought from the Indus Valley could end up as an offering in a temple in Nippur. A copper ingot shipped from the Gulf could become a ritual tool used in a lunar ceremony. And thus, while grain grew in the muddy fields, the spirit of Sumer expanded through invisible routes, driven by need, guided by knowledge, and sustained by trust. Because in the end, all trade is an act of faith. Faith in the other, faith in the road, faith that the object will reach its destination. Now that we know the channels of exchange, we can more clearly see how this economic system was also sustained by conflict. Because wherever there are resources, roots, and prestige, there are also jealousy, tensions, and wars. And the history of Sumer is marked by that. By cities that admired one another, but also spied, betrayed, and clashed in a cycle of alliances and disputes that drew the first political map of humanity. When cities declared war, for centuries, the Sumerian world seemed to be held together by a silent network of temples, canals, and tablets, as if the balance between the gods and men could be maintained indefinitely through offerings, harvests, and meticulous rituals. But beneath the surface of order, tension never fully disappeared. Because the Sumerian cities were not part of a single kingdom, nor did they obey a unified authority. They were autonomous entities, independent, proud, each with its own god, its own temple, its own calendar, its own dialect. And with that independence came conflict. When harvests failed, when trade routes intersected, or irrigated lands became too valuable, the temple gave way to the shield, and the tablet turned into a spear. Sumer was also a land of wars. Each city-state was a complete cell, with its internal organization, its power structures, its army, and its alliances. Some specialized in river trade, others controlled important agricultural nodes, others accumulated religious prestige, and all of them competed in one way or another for the same things: resources, influence, legitimacy. Coexistence was possible, but fragile. One drought, one border dispute, one ambitious king, or one misinterpreted omen was enough for conflict to erupt. These were not wars of annihilation. They were cyclical wars, inevitable, rituals of violence that formed part of the very fabric of Sumerian history. These wars were not always declared with grand gestures or organized armies like those of later great empires. Often they began as skirmishes over the control of a canal, as raids into neighboring fields, or as symbolic reprisals for a disrespected offering. But when tensions escalated, the temples gave their blessing to war. The gods were invoked to protect the army, and every battle was seen as a conflict between deities as well. If Umma attacked Lagash, it was not just a matter of territory. It was Ningirsu confronting Shara, two celestial powers whose outcome would determine the new balance between their peoples. One of the oldest and most well-documented episodes of this ongoing tension is the conflict between Lagash and Umma, two city-states separated by only a few kilometers, yet enemies for generations. The main dispute revolved around a strip of fertile land known as Gu Eden, a border region that both claimed as their own. The area, irrigated with effort, held a key strategic position for the supply of both cities, and neither was willing to yield. Tablets recovered in Lagash recount how this city, under the leadership of the Lugal Eanatum, launched an offensive to reclaim control of those lands. It was not a minor campaign. It was an organized effort, religiously justified and meticulously documented. The culminating act of that war was immortalized in an exceptional piece, the Stele of the Vultures, a carved stone slab that depicts, with rawness and pride, the victory of Lagash over Umma. Its reliefs show soldiers marching in formation, enemies decapitated, prisoners kneeling. But it also shows the god Ningirsu holding a great net filled with the defeated enemies, as if the war were not carried out by men, but by the deity himself through them. This document is not only a military record, it is a declaration of authority, a narrative carved in stone to make clear that legitimate power had triumphed, that order had been restored, and that any rebellion would be crushed with the favor of the gods. In the image of the king with his spear leading his army, there is a political truth hidden that would forever change the balance in Sumer. War could reinforce royal power, consolidate the king's figure as a defender of order, and turn the Lugal into more than just a manager. It made him indispensable. However, wars between cities were not constant nor chaotic. There was a rudimentary diplomacy, temporary agreements, truce treaties inscribed on tablets. Cities sent ambassadors, shared ceremonial calendars, negotiated slowly. But peace was always fragile, because as long as there was competition for resources, water, land, religious prestige, conflict was a matter of time. Even within the cities, kings had to demonstrate their military strength to maintain respect. A weak Lugal was a disposable Lugal, and that pushed many to declare war as an act of legitimation. The battles were not massive confrontations like those that would come with later empires. They were clashes between relatively small but well-organized armies. The weapons were simple but effective: spears, axes, maces. Defense often consisted of leather shields and tight formations. Soldiers were citizens. Farmers temporarily turned into warriors, who had to return to the fields once the campaign ended. And yet, in the midst of that simplicity, war was wrapped in solemnity. It was a ritual, political, and social event. A moment when the city transformed, united, affirmed itself. Some cities learned to live from conflict. Kish, for example, became a model of military power, whose prestige was recognized by other cities even beyond Sumerian territory. Kish appears in many royal lists as the first to have kings after the Great Flood, a symbolic way of saying that its legitimacy was primordial. And indeed, war, when well executed and well told, served to found myths. The victorious king did not only win battles, he won a place in history. Over time, the conflict between Sumerian cities would become so chronic that instead of destroying one another, they would seek ways to impose themselves through temporary hegemonies. Some kings would manage to unify several cities under their authority. Others would establish unstable pacts that lasted just long enough to reorganize the region. Sumerian politics was, in that sense, a constant laboratory of tensions and balances, of ambitions and defeats, of strategies and symbols. Every conflict left a mark, every peace a warning. And yet, despite the confrontations, the cities survived. They rebuilt the canals, restored the temples, wrote new tablets, because the heart of Sumer beat with a resilient force, capable of absorbing the blow and continuing forward. Wars were part of its internal dynamic, like seasons of violence within the great calendar of history. In every campaign, in every victory or humiliation, Sumerian memory was rewritten. What could not be erased by fire was engraved with chisel, and from those stones and tablets emerge, thousands of years later, the voices of a civilization that understood conflict was inevitable, but that its story had to be eternal. Now that the dust of war has settled and the cities resume their course, it is time to look more closely at how these events were not only political or military acts, but also expressions of artistic and symbolic power. Because there is a stele that captures the spirit of all those wars, a stone that speaks with millennial clarity, and its story awaits us in the next chapter. The stone that tells the first war. Somewhere in the south of Iraq, among mounds of dry earth and scattered remains of baked brick, a slab of limestone was unearthed after having remained buried for more than 4 millennia. Its surface, though eroded by time, still preserved figures carved with silent precision. Soldiers marching in formation, defeated enemies kneeling, a god holding a net full of human bodies as if they were mere fish caught in his judgment. That stone was not a simple work of art, nor a funerary decoration. It was a declaration of power, a testimony of blood, a political manifesto carved so it would never be forgotten. History knows it as the Stele of the Vultures, and it tells what was probably the first documented war in human history. Its protagonist, or rather its intellectual and political author, was Eannatum, king of the city-state of Lagash, a strong and calculating ruler who knew how to turn territorial defense into an opportunity to affirm his supremacy. His enemy was Umma, a neighboring city, sister in culture but rival in ambition, with whom Lagash had held tensions for decades over possession of a fertile land called Guedin. That stretch of territory, nourished by the regulated waters of a shared canal, was not merely an agricultural asset. It was a strategic jewel, a symbol of control, abundance, and divine right. The wars between Lagash and Umma were not sudden outbreaks, nor the result of a single event. They were part of a long-standing dispute that flared and faded depending on the circumstances. But when Eannatum came to power, he decided to put an end to that ambiguity. Temporary agreements and religious truces were no longer enough. It was time to act, and to record that action with a symbolic force that would surpass the spoken word or a clay tablet. That is how the stele was born. Not as decoration, but as a political weapon meant to pierce collective memory as deeply as spears pierced enemy bodies. The stele of the vultures is a fragmented piece, like almost all ancient memory, but sufficient to understand its message. On one of its faces, the most well-known, a scene unfolds organized like a vertical comic strip. We see Eannatum marching at the head of his army, spear in hand, protected by a large shield and flanked by aligned soldiers. It is a scene of order, of discipline, of control. In the next section, the enemies lie piled up, defeated, while the vultures, the animals that give the stele its name, hover over the bodies, tearing flesh, eyes, entrails. It is a raw, direct image meant to leave an impression, but not everything is explicit violence. On the reverse of the stele, the tone changes. The god Ningirsu, the tutelary deity of Lagash, appears lifting his divine net in which he has trapped the enemies of his city. He has not killed them with fire or storms, but with a net, a symbol of order, of absolute control. Ningirsu does not destroy through chaos, but through justice. His action is not savage, it is sacred. And beside the god, Eannatum appears once again, this time in a reverent posture, as if his entire victory were merely the execution of celestial will. This dual record, one earthly, one divine, reveals the structure of Sumerian thought regarding war. Battle was not simply a political dispute. It was an extension of cosmic balance, an adjustment between divine wills carried out through men. That is why Eannatum did not present himself as a conqueror, but as an executor of Ningirsu's mandate. Every fallen enemy was a sacrilege corrected, every victory a restoration of universal order. Beyond its aesthetic value, the stele represents one of the first known examples of deliberate political propaganda. Carved and erected to be seen by enemies and allies alike, the stone had a very clear purpose: to immortalize the supremacy of Lagash, to dissuade future rebellions, and to legitimize the king's authority. It was a direct message. This is what happens to those who challenge the will of our God. And that message was not written for the moment. It was carved to endure. We must imagine what it meant back then to be confronted by such an image. In an era when the majority of the population was illiterate and written language was a privilege of the few, stone art was the most powerful medium for ideological transmission. The figures spoke louder than texts. The vultures pecking at corpses were not metaphors. They were warnings. No translation was needed. Fear was universal. But the stele is also a testament to something deeper. It is material proof that history could be written not as an impartial chronicle, but as an instrument of power. Iannatum chose what to show, how to represent it, what to omit. There is no trace on the stone of Lagash's casualties, of possible prior defeats, or of logistical hardships. Everything has been reduced to victory, order, and legitimacy. And that, too, is part of the legacy the Sumerians left us. The awareness that historical narrative is, many times, a form of emotional architecture. After his victory, Iannatum did not only reinforce Lagash's borders, he reorganized control of the canal that irrigated Gu Eden, re-established the payments that Umma was to make as compensation, and recorded his version of events in multiple tablets in addition to the stele. He consolidated his image as a just king, a defender of sacred order, and a faithful servant of his God. And in doing so, he inaugurated a tradition that would be repeated for centuries throughout the Fertile Crescent. The king as a builder of history, as the author of the narrative that upholds his throne. The stele of the vultures is only one among many talking stones that Sumer erected, but its importance is unique, because it was the first to so clearly capture the logic of war as theater, as message, as ritual. And although many of its sections have been lost, although its surface has been gnawed by time, the essential remains. The image of the divine net, the hieratic face of the king, the low flight of the vultures, all of that still speaks to us in a quiet but firm voice from the depths of the millennia. And that voice, which comes from the stone, does not fall silent. Because while the cities built steles to eternalize their battles, daily life continued its course. Men plowed the earth, women baked bread, children learned to read in the houses of tablets. And amid that routine, an inevitable question arises. What was life really like for an ordinary citizen in the land of the first empires? The answer awaits us among adobe courtyards, clay ovens, and school tablets. Because to understand a civilization is not only to listen to its kings, but also to approach the daily murmur of those who built it with their hands. Bread, family, and baked clay. Beyond the wide-based temples, beyond the steles that scream victory from stone, and the kings who proudly inscribe their names on clay tablets, there exists a quieter, softer, more discreet story. A story that is not carved into walls, but one that supports those walls from beneath. The story of those who were neither gods nor kings, but who lived, dreamed, ate, and loved in the baked clay streets that shaped the Sumerian cities. This chapter is not about conquests or treaties, but about warm bread at dawn, voices in family courtyards, and wooden tools resting by the doorway. Because if we truly want to understand what life was like in Sumer, we must descend from the palace and enter the common home. The dwellings of an average Sumerian citizen were modest, functional, built to withstand heat, sudden rains, and the passage of time. They were almost always constructed with sun-dried mud bricks, sometimes reinforced with straw or small stones. Adobe was the omnipresent material, malleable, cheap, reliable. The color of the cities was that of the desert, of dried mud. From a distance, everything seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the houses were mere extensions of the land. In their basic layout, the houses were organized around a central courtyard, which served as an open space for domestic tasks. Cooking, washing, drying food, conversing. Around the courtyard, rooms were arranged, roofed with palm beams and covered with reed mats. Some houses had a second floor with limited use, intended for storage or for resting during warm nights. The layout did not follow aesthetic design but the rhythm of daily life: shade in the morning, ventilation in the afternoon, silence at nightfall. The kitchen was the heart of these homes. A small beehive-shaped clay oven, fueled with firewood or plant remains, was used to bake the bread and cook the stews that nourished the family. The most basic food was a flat, dense barley bread, sometimes sweetened with dates or honey. Alongside it, beer was the usual drink, not only as a festive companion but as part of the daily diet. It was made by fermenting soaked bread and consumed through reeds to filter out solid residues. Eating together was not a mere physiological necessity. It was an act of cohesion, of community. The family was the fundamental social unit. A Sumerian household consisted of an extended core: father, mother, children, married daughters, grandparents, nephews. Each member had a defined role and specific responsibilities. The father was the legal and religious authority of the group. The mother, administrator of the household and transmitter of tradition. Children began to help from a young age, learning the father's trade or the mother's tasks according to their gender. Childhood was short, and work came early. But that did not mean there was no time for play or affection. Women in Sumer occupied a more active role than we usually imagine when speaking of ancient societies. They could manage property, sign contracts, participate in commercial transactions, and work as priestesses, scribes, or potters. Written sources record wills, lawsuits, and agreements in which women appear as full legal subjects. Motherhood was valued, but the presence of women was not limited to the domestic sphere. There were educated women, travelers, artisans, and some, very few but very visible, came to occupy high-ranking religious positions. Work defined a large part of personal identity. Men could be farmers, potters, tanners, fishermen, boatmen, builders, or soldiers depending on the era and the need. Cities were like living bodies where each craft occupied a street, a neighborhood, a recognized function. The potter knew exactly where to find the best clay. The weaver understood the precise twist of the thread. The scribe had memorized the correct form of every sign. Trades were passed down from generation to generation and were a source of family pride. Sumerian tablets, often kept in chests or shelves made from pressed clay, record daily life with touching precision. Lease contracts, dowry lists, payment receipts, neighbor disputes, school tablets with writing exercises, complaints of petty theft, wills. These were not texts written for posterity, but for the present, for immediate management. And thanks to that pragmatic intention, they have given us an intimate and sincere portrait of common life. Children attended the Eduba, the house of tablets, where they learned to write, read, count, and memorize religious and administrative texts. It was not mass education. Only some had access, generally the children of well-off families or those connected to the temple. But those who succeeded entered a completely new world. Being a scribe opened the door to a respected social role, which could take a young person from local administration to the archives of the palace or temple. Spirituality was not separate from domestic life. It was everywhere. In the small figures of household gods placed in sacred corners of the home. In the prayers that accompanied the start of each day. In the clay amulets hung on doors, protecting children from the evil eye and pregnant women from night demons. In the way neighbors greeted each other. In the arrangement of utensils. In the calendar days dedicated to ritual rest. Living in Sumer meant living under the constant rhythm of a practical, deep, and daily devotion. Life was not easy. Illnesses were frequent. Life expectancy was short, floods and droughts unpredictable, and justice often depended on social position. But there was beauty too, in courtyards with flowers, in perfumes prepared with oils and petals, in folk songs that accompanied work, in carefully chosen and meaningful names, in the myths told by grandparents under the stars. Common people did not live to make history, but through their actions, they wove the fabric upon which the great names stood. The city, seen from ground level, was a constant choreography of repeated gestures. The woman who sweeps the threshold at dawn, the young man drawing water from the canal, the baker opening his oven with the first sun, the old man watching from his clay bench while repeating the names of his ancestors. That repetition was not empty routine. It was meaning. It was embodied memory. It was civilization. And among the mud walls, the forgotten tablets, the remains of broken pots, modern archaeologists have managed to reconstruct that lost world that still breathes in every fragment. A world that was not grand in appearance, but essential. Because without those anonymous men and women, without their weathered hands, without their bare feet walking through adobe streets, there would have been no temples, no kings, no epics to tell. And now that we have inhabited, even for a moment, the humble homes of Sumer, it is time to take a closer look at what happened when balance was broken, when the body fell ill, when the soul became lost, when fear forced people to seek answers in the invisible. Because medicine in Sumer was a delicate border between experience and mystery, and its history is woven with herbs, prayers, and demons lurking in the shadows. Diseases, demons, and healers. In the baked mud houses where merchants, weavers, and scribes of Sumer slept, there was a silent enemy that recognized neither status nor walls. Disease. It arrived without warning, piercing the calm of the night, shaking bodies with nameless fevers, covering skin with strange blotches, or stealing the breath from newborns before they could utter a word. And when illness entered, everyday life, with all its order, its tablets, and its prayers, came to a halt. Because falling ill in Sumer was not merely a physical problem, it was a threat that could imply guilt, punishment, bad luck, sin, or the fury of a spirit. The Sumerians did not conceive of health as a neutral state, nor of illness as a simple physical imbalance. Every pain had a hidden cause, an invisible intention, a narrative to decipher. The body was more than flesh and bone. It was the dwelling place of the soul, and a reflection of one's relationships with the gods, with the dead, with the forces that lived at the edges of the world. When someone fell ill, the diagnosis was not made by merely observing the wound, but also by examining the dreams of the previous night, the actions of recent days, forgotten offerings, mispronounced names, broken oaths. Among the many beings that inhabited the Sumerian imagination, there were dark entities, difficult to describe precisely, regarded as bearers of disease, spirits of disorder, demons of the air, invisible forces lurking in poorly swept corners or in cursed objects. One of the most feared was Asag, a demon capable of provoking fever with his mere presence, accompanied by legions of spectral beings made of plague. Asag did not attack with knives or spears, but with the heat that climbed through the bones, with the weakness that turned the body into a dry desert. Sumerian medicine was, therefore, a complex field in which two major paths coexisted: the path of empirical knowledge and the path of ritual knowledge. Although today we would separate them clearly, for the Sumerians they were branches of the same tree. The healer was not a technician. He was also an interpreter of the world. He knew about herbs, but also about symbols. He understood the effects of boiled water, but also the power of a properly spoken word. It was necessary to soothe the body, yes, but more than anything, it was necessary to soothe the invisible world surrounding it. The medical tablets recovered from cities like Nippur or Uruk offer a fascinating portrait of the art of healing in Sumer. Treatments are described in detail: formulas to prepare ointments, infusions, poultices. Local ingredients were used, such as licorice root, onion, garlic, salt, and bitumen, combined with techniques like fumigation or bandaging. Even rudimentary surgical procedures are described, such as lancing abscesses or treating fractures. But always alongside the physical recipe appeared the ritual part, an invocation, a prayer, a spell. There were specialists who leaned more toward one end or the other of this dual vision. On one side was the Asu, the practical physician, who prepared remedies, observed symptoms, and recorded treatments. On the other was the Ashipu, the exorcist, who confronted the invisible, diagnosed the spiritual cause of the illness, and battled it with sacred words. Both were necessary. One worked on the body, the other on the spirit. In many cases, they cooperated. In others, they blurred into each other, because the line between science and magic was not a boundary, but a fabric. Spells were not recited frivolously. They were formulas charged with intention, rhythm, and direct invocation. The god of healing was called upon. Mercy was begged of the angry spirits, and attempts were made to convince the evil to leave the body and return to the desert, to the brackish waters, to where it belonged. Some of these incantations were sung with simple melodies. Others were recited to the beat of a drum. Each illness had its own voice, each healing its own music. One of the most important deities in this context was Gula, goddess of healing, sometimes represented with a dog, a symbol of loyalty and regenerative power. It was believed that Gula could restore destroyed bodies, reverse decay, and keep death at bay. Her temples sometimes functioned as places of healing, where the sick would spend entire nights awaiting a revelatory dream, a whisper that would indicate the path to recovery. Rituals in her name combined offerings of bread, milk, honey, and small figurines of the affected organs, which were either buried or thrown into the river as a way to release the illness. There were also diagnostic practices that, from our modern perspective, border on the poetic. Dreams were interpreted, patterns were observed in smoke, in water, in the behavior of domestic animals. The tongue was examined, the color of urine, the direction of sweat. Every detail could be a message. The body spoke, but not with its own voice. It spoke as a messenger of greater forces, sometimes benevolent, sometimes vengeful. Fever, sudden blindness, paralysis, skin diseases, loss of blood, all could be signs that something in the world's order had been twisted. And the healer's task was not only to cure the sick person, but to restore that order. That is why treatments often involved social acts, public apologies, return of stolen objects, repair of broken promises. Because the sick body was not just an individual issue, it was a reflection of a community in imbalance. Sumerian healers and exorcists were respected, feared, sometimes revered. Their work was uncertain, their success ambiguous. If the patient recovered, it was due to their wisdom. If not, it was because the evil was stronger, or because the guilt remained hidden. Sometimes they were summoned by the powerful. Other times, they worked in poor neighborhoods, using the same handful of herbs over and over, trusting that the spirit would eventually give in. Their names were rarely recorded, but their mark remains in hundreds of tablets that carry formulas repeated with only slight variations, as if each one were a desperate attempt to persuade the universe to relent. And among all this pain, among the fear, the ritual whisper, and the fever that would not break, there is also tenderness. In tablets that show prayers for sick children, in fragments where a father offers everything he has to save his wife, in symbols carved onto small protective beads hung around the neck as a final defense. There is no ancient civilization that did not feel, in the face of illness, the same things we feel today: vulnerability, hope, a desire to understand. Sumerian medicine was, in the end, a profound mirror of the human soul. It showed that the body cannot be understood without the world that surrounds it. That healing is not only the removal of a symptom, but the repair of broken bonds, the calming of disturbed forces, the restoration of harmony between the visible and the invisible. And while the healers carried out their work, in other parts of the city, the human mind continued searching for ways to explain the universe. Because if the gods could punish, they could also reveal. If the signs of fever had meaning, why not also the stars? Why not the movement of the heavens, the course of the celestial bodies, the slow dance of the planets? The gaze of Sumer was beginning to lift from the body and settle upon the firmament, and from that gesture would be born one of its most enduring obsessions, the reading of destiny in the sky. Music for the gods and beer for the people. In the heart of the Sumerian city, where the temple rose like a mountain of baked clay and the streets intertwined around its walls, sound was the pulse that kept urban routine alive. The clinking of vessels, the echo of footsteps, the murmur of the river, and above all, the rhythms that emerged from homes, plazas, and altars. Music had two main purposes: to rise toward the sky as an offering, and to remain among humans as celebration. In that ancient world, melodies were living offerings, and well-accompanied melodies blended with the thick aroma of homemade beer, Sumer's emblematic and social drink, intended for both gods and mortals. Ritual music accompanied every ceremony, every sacrifice, every temple procession. Tall frame harps were played, 8 to 10 string lyres, wind instruments such as reed flutes and double flutes, in addition to various types of drums. Each instrument was designed to resonate with the structure of the temple and the divine message. The harp had a wide and bright range. The lyre was ideal for accompanying sacred chants. The flutes marked the rhythm of prayers. In the temple of Nippur, dedicated to Enlil, there were permanent orchestras formed by professional musicians funded by the sanctuary. The more complex the religious construction, the more elaborate the music that accompanied it. The process of musical transmission was oral, but also involved written forms. Musicians learned in schools linked to the temple, intensive spaces where they spent years with masters who taught not only the living art, but also the symbolism behind each piece. Some tablets contained instructions for ritual performance, symbolic notations indicating the type of instrument, the specific festival, the duration, even the intonation. The musician in Sumer had to be an interpreter of the divine, a mediator between the human and the sacred. Vocalization had a special presence. Hymns were recited or sung in languages that sometimes blended Sumerian with Akkadian in later periods. They were so elaborate that they could narrate the creation of the world, the triumph of a god, the arrival of spring, or the exaltation of a king. Part of their power resided in the form, rhythmic lengths, repetitions, cadences, designed to induce emotional or spiritual states. Music in the temple was a vehicle of inner transformation, a way to alter the perception of time in favor of the divine. But not all music was solemn. Public celebrations, harvest season festivals, funerals, weddings, all were adorned with instruments and song. In those cases, melody coexisted with laughter, the mark of a people who understood that life was also a flow of cycles whose energy had to be exalted. And then, to accompany those occasions, beer took center stage. It was brewed at home, with germinated and carefully fermented barley, using clay jugs or stone vessels where the thick liquid was deposited for a festive day. Unlike bread, which was part of the daily diet, beer had a social and symbolic role. It was mashed, left to ferment, filtered with straws, and stored in jars. It was a drink low in alcoholic strength but rich in body and flavor, a way to share gossip, trust, and communal warmth. It was consumed from shared pitchers by men and women alike, with a beverage that could be mixed with dates or aromatic herbs, transforming it into a ceremonial elixir. Beer was also part of the ritual economy. Tablets record quantities destined for the temple, used for religious expenditures, official feasts, and as payment for musicians, laborers, and priests. Without it, the tempo of the ritual day could not be sustained. Beer marked the hours dedicated to worship, to the banquet, to rest. Music and beer formed the perfect pair to reinforce the social fabric. The craftsmanship of musicians and brewers was recognized. The master brewer had a place of honor in some communities, with unique recipes, distinctive flavors, and a reputation based on the quality of the product. The master harpist, for his part, treasured oral documents passed down from generation to generation. In some temples, competitions were organized during lunar celebrations, where musical skill was measured and rewarded with marriage or sacred food. In the domestic sphere, simple melodies were also heard, accompanied by clapping, whistling, and the usual improvised voice. Children sang while playing with clay dolls. Housewives sang to soften the hardship of washing clothes or to mark the rhythm of grinding. Music was part of the act, inseparable from the day's routine. This intimate bond between music, beer, and community life shaped a vital aesthetic where the human and the divine coexisted. Music had the power to summon, to root, to turn the moment into ritual, and beer facilitated closeness among those present. The feast was a shared ritual as powerful as prayer, and in many cases the ritual was completed with a combination of musical offering and banquet for the gods. This chapter on music and beer in Sumer reveals that an advanced society was also a society capable of containing the sacred and the human within the same acts. And that discovery is not a conclusion, but rather opens the door to explore one of the most complex and powerful myths of that civilization, that of Inanna, rebellious goddess of desire, of eroticism, of war, and of death. Because if music uplifted the spirit, Inanna challenged it with her intensity. Inanna, and the power that does not ask for permission. There are names that are not spoken lightly. Names that, when pronounced, resonate like a blast of hot wind in the midst of silence, heavy and fiery, full of desire and storm. In Sumer, one of those names was Inanna. She was not just a goddess. She was a whirlwind with a human face, the one who loved, conquered, argued, died, and resurrected. The one who made decisions without asking, who refused to be boxed in, who did not recognize male hierarchies, and who, when she appeared before the other gods, did so dressed in absolute power, her eyes glowing like an afternoon that foretells a storm. Inanna was many things at once. Lady of the sky, queen of the earth, protector of Uruk, guardian of the Me, those mysterious divine principles that govern the world, keeper of sexual love, of warlike conflict, of the secrets that circulate between life and death. She was not the goddess of a single force, but the embodiment of excess, of crossing boundaries, of instability. In a world where deities usually had limited functions, Inanna was the exception that transgressed boundaries with a fierce smile. Sometimes she appeared soft, seductive, wrapped in perfume. Other times, covered in blood, with a spear held high. Always intense, always free. One of the oldest and most complex myths we have about her is that of the descent into the underworld, a story woven from the substance of deep dreams, recited for centuries as a warning, a lesson, a mirror. In this tale, Inanna chooses to descend into Kur, the dark realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. No one forces her. She is not fleeing, nor is she pursued. She goes because she wants to, because she has decided, because something within her needs to touch the edge. Before departing, she prepares herself. She adorns her body with her 7 sacred ornaments: crown, necklaces, rings, scepters, ritual garments. Each one represents an aspect of her power, and as she passes through each of the 7 gates of the underworld, the guardians demand she relinquish one. Thus, piece by piece, Inanna sheds her symbols, her shields, her masks. She arrives at the heart of the realm of death with nothing, vulnerable, human. And there, before her sister's throne, she is judged, killed, and hung like a piece of flesh. The world above begins to wither. Sex fades, the crops dry up, the drumbeat of desire falls silent. But Inanna is not a goddess who disappears forever. After 3 days, with the help of her loyal followers, and by the order of the great gods, she is rescued and returns. But she is no longer the same. She has known emptiness, loss, fragility. Her return is not a shallow triumph. It is maturity, rebirth. Her descent is a powerful metaphor of feminine power as a force that embraces darkness in order to understand its own depth. This myth has many interpretations. For some, it is an allegory of the agricultural cycle. The earth dies and blooms again. For others, it is a spiritual lesson about the ego, about the need to let go of everything we think we are in order to be born anew. But in all cases, Inanna emerges as a figure completely distinct from the female deities of other ancient cultures. She does not wait to be saved. She is not submissive. She is not defined by motherhood. She is defined by will, by action, by uncompromising courage. Her influence was so strong that her priests and priestesses held real positions of power in the cities. In Uruk, it was common for major religious celebrations to revolve around her figure, and there are records of rituals in which hierogamy was practiced, the symbolic union between the king and the goddess, where a man represented Dumutzi, her consort, and a priestess embodied Inanna. This act, more than a mere sexual rite, was a cosmic pact that regenerated political power, renewed the land, and reaffirmed the sovereign's legitimacy. Without Inanna, the throne had no divine backing. She was the key. In the texts, she appears as a strategist, a passionate lover, a vengeful figure. She falls in love, makes demands, leaves, returns. In one story, she ascends to the heavens to obtain the me, the essential principles of knowledge and order. She steals them from Enki, god of water and wisdom, by getting him drunk on beer and cunning. She takes them to Uruk in her sacred boat, and when Enki realizes what has happened, it is too late. She has made them her own. The story does not portray her as a thief, but as someone who knows her worth and is unwilling to ask for permission to claim it. Inanna had temples, sculptures, entire hymns dedicated to her. In the oldest songs, she is called the one who opens the gates of heaven, the one who tames the wild, the one who walks between blood and blossom without losing balance. Her image was so powerful that over time her figure evolved into other goddesses: Ishtar in Babylon, Astarte in Canaan, Venus in Rome. But the essential core, the pure will, the blend of passion, strength, and contradiction always remained. Because Inanna was, at her heart, the oldest symbol of power that does not apologize for existing. She also represented the principle of ambiguity. She was feminine, yet a warrior, tender, yet relentless, a protector of life, yet also of battle. Her gaze reflected the heart of a culture that understood the sacred did not have to be tame, that the divine could be fierce, sensual, ambiguous. And for that reason, her cult did not disappear easily. It persisted in tablets, in gestures, in whispered prayers by those who saw in her something they could not find in other gods, a direct, visceral, profound connection. Women, especially, saw in Inanna a complex yet relatable figure, a goddess who felt rage, who desired with intensity, who claimed her space. And men, far from fearing her, revered her as a mediator of desire, as an indispensable figure in the cosmic architecture. No one could rule without her blessing. No one could sow without her permission. In a world where male deities dominated the celestial structure, Inanna broke the rules. She was a force that crossed boundaries, dismantled hierarchies, disrupted the balance. And that discomfort she provoked was also her gift. She compels us, even now, to ask ourselves what true power is made of, and why we are so often taught to fear it when it speaks with a female voice. Among the music that echoed through the temples and the tablets that recorded the dreams of cities, Inanna remained present, like an echo no one could ignore. Her worship was a permanent reminder that the divine could be desire, beauty, blood, creation, and destruction all at once. And in that convergence of forces, Sumerian culture found its most honest reflection. From the sky and from the earth, the figure of Inanna still speaks to us today with the same intensity as 5,000 years ago. And while her story was etched into walls and bodies, other voices began to emerge, voices that were neither human nor divine, but that spoke from the heavens with patterns, cycles, promises, and warnings. Because in the Sumerian night, the stars also had something to say. Gilgamesh and the sorrow of heroes. There are figures that time does not erode, that survive ruins, empires, and languages that are no longer spoken, because they are not merely characters in a story. They are mirrors in which humanity has chosen to gaze again and again, with fear, with hope, with the certainty that there is something in them that resembles us too much. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, demigod, invincible warrior, grieving friend, tireless seeker, is one of those figures. And what has made him eternal is not his strength, nor his crown, nor even his feats, but his sorrow. That deep crack that runs through him when he realizes that, no matter how many temples he builds, how many monsters he defeats, how many cities he rules, time spares no one. Gilgamesh was real. He lived as king of Uruk toward the end of the 3rd millennium before our era. But beyond the man, the myth was born. And that myth grew, accumulating voices, shaped across the centuries until it became the oldest epic poem we know. It is not merely a tale of adventures. It is a meditation on life, death, fear, friendship, and the impossibility of escaping fate. Whoever reads it, or listens to it, carefully will discover that it is not a story of glory, but a long elegy. Everything begins with a young and arrogant king. Gilgamesh rules with an iron fist. The citizens complain. He is strong, yes, but unjust. He respects no boundaries. He takes what he wants. So the gods decide to give him a counterpart, someone to balance him. They create Enkidu, a wild creature who lives with animals, who knows nothing of cities or laws. A free, innocent, fierce being. He is civilized through the contact of a wise woman. And when he enters Uruk, the first thing he does is challenge Gilgamesh. They fight. The combat is epic, evenly matched. And there, in the midst of the struggle, something unexpected is born. Friendship. A total, radiant, indestructible friendship. Gilgamesh and Enkidu become inseparable. Together they undertake impossible feats. They travel to the cedar forest to confront the feared Humbaba. They defeat him. Later, they kill the bull of heaven, sent by the goddess Ishtar as punishment when Gilgamesh rejects her. Each victory elevates them. But the gods, as always, watch with unease those who feel invincible, and they pronounce a sentence. One of the two must die. The chosen one is Enkidu. The death of Enkidu is the moment when the poem turns upon itself. Gilgamesh, who until then had seemed to stride across the world with the steps of a giant, collapses. He weeps, he despairs, he asks why. Why does his friend die? Why do the strong fall? Why does life vanish without reason? And then, a new quest is born in him, the search for immortality. He no longer wants temples or glory. He no longer wishes to sing of victories. He wants to defeat death. He wants to find Utnapishtim, the only mortal who has been pardoned by the gods, the only one who has received eternal life. The journey he undertakes is a march into the unknown. He crosses deserts. He passes through mountains. He reaches the ends of the world, where darkness is total, where giant scorpions guard the gates that no human has ever crossed. Each step is a renunciation. Each advance is a confession that he is afraid, that he has become aware of his own fragility, that he is no longer the impulsive young man who broke doors with his chest. Gilgamesh is tired, filthy, broken, but he continues, because he knows that if he does not find the answer, he will never again be able to see the world the same way. When he finally finds Utnapishtim, the old man tells him his story. How the gods sent a flood to destroy humanity. How he was warned. How he built a boat. How he survived. How he was granted the gift of eternal life as an exception. But he also tells him something more, that this gift will not be repeated. That humans by design are ephemeral. That what makes life valuable is not its length, but its intensity. Gilgamesh listens, he begs, he insists. But fate is unchangeable. Before returning, he is offered a test, to remain awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh fails. Sleep defeats him. Then he is told of the existence of a magical plant that can restore his youth. He finds it. But as he bathes in a river, a serpent steals it from him. Once again, loss. Once again, a limit. And then, with a heart full of questions and empty hands, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He looks at its walls. He walks its streets. And he understands. He will not conquer eternity. But he has seen the face of pain. He has felt love, fury, loss. He has lived with intensity, and he decides to tell his story, to have it engraved, so that it is not erased, so that whoever comes afterward may hear it and know that to be human is to love and to lose, to seek and not find, to fear and to keep walking. The poem of Gilgamesh is not about a hero who conquers the world. It is about one who is conquered by death. And that is why it moves us. Because in him we all see ourselves reflected. Those who once wished that time could stop, that a friendship could last forever, that pain could be avoided. But it cannot. The only thing we can do is look back, gather the fragments of what we have lived, and narrate them with dignity. Gilgamesh ceased to be a king of stone to become a voice that never fades. His lament is the lament of humanity waking from the dream of eternity, and his return to Uruk, without remedy or magical plant, is the serene acceptance that all things human are valuable because they come to an end. Among the architecture of the gods, the inventions of men, and the songs that echoed along the mud-brick walls, the story of Gilgamesh marked the moment when the Sumerians not only narrated deeds, but reflected on the human condition. And with that, they laid the foundation of something new. Because when the hero became mortal, literature became eternal. And while Gilgamesh carved his story into stone, the peoples of the south looked to the horizon with fear. Something was coming from the desert, a new breath of power, a growing threat. Because the Sumerian world was about to meet its conquerors, the Akkadians. The laws that were born before Babylon. In the collective memory of the ancient world, when one speaks of laws, codes, and justice, the first name that usually comes to mind is Hammurabi. His carved stone stele, with its rules inscribed in cuneiform and his image facing a god, has become almost a universal symbol of early justice. But long before Hammurabi, long before Babylon raised its towers of brick, there was another people who had already felt the need to set rules. Another people who understood that without boundaries there can be no city, and without justice there can be no lasting peace. That people were the Sumerians. And among them, before Hammurabi, there was a king named Ur-Nammu, who looked around and decided that chaos must have a border. We are in the 21st century before our era. The city of Ur is flourishing once again under the rule of a sovereign who does not seek only to build temples, but to organize daily life with precision. Ur-Nammu was not a solitary visionary. He was a strategist. He understood that a city is not governed solely from the throne or with troops. It is also governed from the public squares, through contracts, and through mutual trust, between the farmer and the judge, the merchant and the scribe, the citizen and the temple. And for this reason, he ordered that what had until then only been transmitted through oral tradition be inscribed on clay tablets, the laws. The so-called Code of Ur-Nammu is, as far as we know, the oldest legal text in the world. Its existence shows that the Sumerians had already grasped something essential: that justice cannot depend on the ruler's mood or an official's whim. It must be written so that all, gods, kings, and slaves alike, know what to expect. This innovation, despite its simplicity, forever changed the history of human organization. The form of the code is surprising in its tone. Far from ruthless punishment or ritual vengeance, the document conveys a clear intention to establish order without crushing. There are penalties, yes, but also proportionality. Theft is punished, but not necessarily with death. There are financial compensations, physical sanctions, and at the same time, an acknowledgement of social hierarchies. Everything is measured. Everything has its value. In a time when power could be brutal, this text suggests moderation. The code begins with an almost poetic justification. Ur-Nammu has been chosen by the gods Enlil and Inanna, and therefore his task is not merely to rule, but to establish justice, to protect the widow, the orphan, and the weak. This image of the king as a guarantor of balance, and not merely as a wielder of swords, speaks to us of a vision of leadership that seeks harmony instead of terror. It is not an egalitarian society, but it is one that tries to guarantee a minimum level of equity within the established order. The laws of the code cover many aspects of daily life: marriage, inheritance, property, loans, bodily harm. It establishes, for example, what happens if one man injures another, if an adulterous woman is discovered, if a slave escapes, if a son disobeys his father. But it also legislates over commercial contracts, prices, and debts. What is remarkable is that all of this does not emerge from the temple as a religious revelation, but from the palace, from the administrative center that is beginning to understand itself as the rational core of Sumerian society. The fact that these laws were written in Sumerian and not in Akkadian, the language that was beginning to dominate the region, speaks to an attempt to preserve identity in the midst of a changing environment. The language of the law is not that of the invader, but that of the ancestors. The words that govern justice are the same used to name clay, wheat, the temple, the mother, and that is no coincidence. Sumerian law does not arise as an imposition, but as a reflection of a culture seeking itself amid transition. The judges who applied these laws were officials of both the temple and the palace. Hearings were held in public spaces, where witnesses, scribes, and citizens participated in the proceedings. Writing, once again, guaranteed memory. Every contract, every decision was recorded. The tablets were the equivalent of archives, of official records, of unappealable documents. In this way, legal decisions became part of the civil fabric. Law was not just law, it was narrative etched into clay. In this context, the role of the scribe takes on extraordinary significance. He was not merely someone who wrote things down. He was the one who translated the will of power into concrete symbols, who ensured that what was said became fixed, that what was agreed could not be forgotten. His work was technical, but also political, and in more than one case, it was they who ensured the survival of these codes, by copying them, archiving them, and preserving them across generations. The Code of Ur-Nammu marks a turning point because it introduces the idea of a rational, written, and minimally equitable justice. Of course, it was shaped by the class system, by patriarchal logic, and by strong religious influence. But even within these structures, it represents a clear will to structure human coexistence through predictable rules, rather than through arbitrariness. Decades later, other codes would follow this model, that of Lipit Ishtar, that of Eshnunna, and of course that of Hammurabi. But all of them stem from this first Sumerian intuition, that cities do not endure by force, but by the trust people have in the existence of justice, that the word, when engraved in stone or in clay, can protect just as much as an army. And so, while kings continued to wage wars over territory and cities continued to grow in number and complexity, something deeper was being written on the walls of Ur, a way of living together without killing one another, of resolving conflict without destruction. In the heart of Sumer, law became a common language. And as if time itself understood that nothing can last forever, that city which once sought to order the world also began to sense its own end. Because Ur, brilliant and harmonious, was about to enter its final great era, an era that shone with serene splendor, before fading like a star that has already given all its light. The impossible splendor of Ur under the moon. On a clear night during the distant days of the third dynasty of Ur, the moonlight reflected off the ziggurats and terraces of baked brick, casting a silvery glow that seemed to merge the sky with the earth. Ur, once a minor city, had risen anew with renewed strength under the rule of visionary kings who combined political power, religious faith, and an unprecedented architectural ambition. It was a period in which the Sumerian past seemed to culminate in a near-poetic expression of civilization, a city whose greatness would be forever inscribed in the memory of the ancient world. King Shulgi, perhaps the most emblematic monarch of this dynasty, ascended the throne with a clear project: to raise Ur beyond the earthly realm, to transform it into a divine mirror. Under his rule, temples were restored, legal codes reissued, schools for scribes and musicians reactivated. But above all, an architectural revolution was launched that turned the urban landscape into a manifesto of believers and rulers. The city walls were raised stronger and higher, canals were beautified, markets organized, and a new urban harmony emerged, that of a city conceived for eternity. The jewel of this project was the ziggurat dedicated to the god Inanna, lord of the moon and protector of Ur. Built in multiple phases, it reached a phenomenal height for its time and became the symbolic center of the city. Its stepped structure seemed to ascend to the moon itself, bringing it closer, shortening the distance between the human and the divine. On its upper levels, nocturnal rituals were held where moonlight mingled with incense and the chants of priests, giving the site an almost mystical dimension. Ur's splendor was not limited to public buildings. Many neighborhoods flourished in the warmth of stability and economic prosperity. Artisans worked alabaster, lapis lazuli, and shell with exquisite perfection. Their creations were not mere luxury items, but vessels of an aesthetic that blended beauty and function, symbol and daily use. Tablets from that era record goods sent to distant lands and contracts for building palaces, canals, and ships. Everything worked because the city truly seemed to believe that the future was built with bricks, with law, and with contained faith. Daily life also reached new levels of sophistication. Markets were organized into central plazas, partially roofed, and grain and beer suppliers came daily to serve a city no longer sustained solely by traditional tribute. Messengers appeared, judicial officials, full-time doctors registered in professional guilds, and even networks for storage and distribution that recommended optimal dates for planting and harvesting. There was a sense of collective belonging confronting the passage of time. Ur was reclaiming its destiny. Shulgi was also a poet. He composed hymns that celebrated his work, his piety, his strength, and he left records of many sacrifices made in the name of Inanna. His words were carved into columns and inscribed on tablets, bearing witness to his conviction. Ur would not merely be a city. It would be a testament to what a government can achieve when it pursues an elevated ideal. And though it might sound aspirational, the truth is that his administration lived in an almost miraculous balance, neither decadent nor militaristic, focused on law, construction, and ritual. This spirit of balance was palpable in the cobbled streets, in the family courtyards where Sumerian families celebrated weddings, in the schools where music and astronomy were taught together. All activities walked a fine line between the practical, the aesthetic, and the spiritual. It was a social fabric that felt cohesive and strong, determined to perpetuate itself, and nighttime was its finest hour. The moonlit ceremonies were massive events, where the entire city trembled with chants and ceremonial steps echoing centuries of collective faith. However, that luminous peace and constructive confidence burned atop a fragile epic. Ur shone, but so did the geopolitical horizon of Mesopotamia. Nearby, in Babylon and other centers, minor figures began to cast envious eyes on Ur's splendor. Trade interests multiplied, border tensions reappeared, and the forests of Lebanon and the mountains of Taurus became strategic objectives. The balance Ur promoted today was being questioned on other fronts, and the city's brilliance regained its vulnerable character. The story of Ur under the moon was an extreme one. Intense, passionate, brilliant in its peak, and delicate like a nocturnal flower. That urban giant the gods seemed to have blessed bore, in its internal rhythm, the awareness that nothing lasts forever. Shulgi knew it, the scribes knew it, and the city, within its walls, breathed that tension, to inhabit greatness and fear for it. The final scene of that period shows the king reading his hymns beneath the moon, fully aware that he was writing the last page of a prodigious chapter. And so, while the final ritual chords faded into the structure of the ziggurat and the tablets were stored in the temple vaults, a new shadow approached. A shadow that would not come swiftly or dramatically like a military conquest, but slowly, steadily, almost silently. A shadow that would bring with it new names, new customs, and a reconfiguration of the region. For after splendor comes transformation, and Ur, as a witness to itself, was preparing to change without dying. The sand that buried their names. No one knew exactly when it ceased to be. There was no fire that swept everything away, no army that entered with waving banners, no single catastrophe that could be pinpointed in the records. Sumer did not fall like a tower under attack, did not implode with apocalyptic thunder. Sumer unraveled like dreams upon waking, like the scent left in an old garment. One day the tablets simply stopped being written in Sumerian, the songs changed language, the priests forgot certain prayers, and the names of the cities continued to be used, but no one remembered what they meant. It was a collapse without clamor, and for that very reason, more unsettling. After the splendor of Ur under the moon, following the death of Shulgi and the unstable reign of his successors, the system began to fragment. Trade routes became unsafe, storehouses emptied, crops began to fail. It was not the fault of a single cause, but a combination that wove a web of weaknesses. Climate change reduced the flow of the rivers. The soil became saline from excessive irrigation. Fields ceased to produce grain, and people began to move. When the countryside is exhausted, the city dies slowly. To this was added the pressure of the semi-nomadic peoples from the west. The Amorites, inhabitants of the desert and the margins, began to infiltrate the Sumerian cities. They did not arrive as barbarian invaders, but as shepherds, merchants, laborers. They settled, learned the language, adopted the customs. But as they gained power and occupied key positions, the traditional elites were displaced. And in less than a century, many cities were no longer ruled by Sumerian kings, but by leaders with Akkadian or Amorite names. The transformation was deep and silent. At the same time, the Sumerian language, never clearly related to any neighboring tongues, began to disappear from daily speech. Akkadian, closer to Semitic languages and better suited to adapt to the new times, replaced it in administration and official texts. Scribes still taught Sumerian in schools as a sacred language, like Latin in the Middle Ages, but the living tongue was already gone. No one spoke Sumerian in the markets. No one used it to pray to the new gods. The temples, once the center of urban life, began to empty. Some cities were completely abandoned. Others became minor centers within new networks of power. The tablets recording taxes, marriages, irrigation agreements, or legal rulings became increasingly scarce. The clay stopped speaking, and there, in that written silence, the true end began. For centuries, the Sumerian ruins lay buried under layers of sand and oblivion. New cities were built on top of them, sometimes completely unaware that beneath their feet slept palaces, libraries, and ancient streets. Later peoples vaguely remembered the kings of ancient times, mentioned them in legends, distorted their names. Gilgamesh became a giant, a demigod lost among myths. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash became empty sounds, places no one could explain. And so, the people who invented writing, who shaped the first codes of law, who built the first cities with planned vision, were erased from human history for millennia. It was as if humanity had once dreamed them and then forgotten upon waking. Not even their memory survived, and for over 2,000 years, their existence was entirely ignored. But history has a mysterious quality. It always leaves traces, even if the human eye takes centuries to learn how to see them. In the 19th century, British and French explorers and archaeologists began excavating the plains of Mesopotamia. What they found were not castles or visible treasures, but mounds of hardened earth, artificial hills that turned out to be the ruins of lost cities. And inside them, thousands of clay tablets marked with signs no one understood. When cuneiform was finally deciphered, the names began to reappear. Gilgamesh, Ur, Nippur, Enheduanna, Enlil. The dead language regained its voice. And then the world learned that before the Assyrians, before the Babylonians, before even Abraham or Moses, there had existed a people who shaped clay in order to speak through it, who invented the city, the contract, the calendar, literature, and then vanished like smoke. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: they did not die suddenly. They simply ceased to be. That cities can fall not from siege, but from abandonment. That languages do not need fire to disappear, only indifference. That history is sometimes like a current that pulls everything into oblivion, except what someone, somewhere dares to write down. In the sand that buried Sumer, there was no revenge and no glory. Only time, only wind, only the weight of accumulated silence. And yet, among the grains of dust and the remnants of walls, an echo still slept. An echo that would rise again centuries later to remind us that what we are, our way of telling stories, of living, of measuring, of trading, of burying our dead, began with them. And although their names were lost for a time, Their legacy never stopped pulsing beneath our history. And so, at the end of this long journey through baked bricks, ziggurats, and recovered tablets, the final question opens. What remains when everything is gone? Because sometimes the most enduring thing is not stone, nor gold, nor temples, but the invisible mark left behind by an idea. And it is there that we enter the final chapter, where we no longer speak of cities or kings, but of that which still lives on today, without our knowing it was born in the mud of Sumer. The immortal echo of those who wrote first. When looking at a Sumerian clay tablet, one may feel an inexplicable shiver. It is not just a piece of hardened mud. It is the voice of someone who lived 5,000 years ago, who breathed under that same relentless sun, who suffered, loved, or feared, and who decided to leave behind a word. That act, seemingly simple, was the heartbeat that kept the memory of an entire civilization alive. Today, those tablets still speak to us, their hand-drawn lines raised from the mud, the most enduring monument humankind has ever built. Writing, that bridge between the moment and eternity. The Sumerians did not invent writing for poetry or for art. They did it to manage, to count, to control, to remember. But that pragmatic tool eventually transformed into an instrument of cultural power. The tablets that recorded barley sales evolved into hymns, epics, and legal codes. From tribute lists came schools. From contracts, history was born. From the need to organize came the alphabet. And with it, humanity changed forever. There was no space in Sumer where writing did not break in. It entered the temple walls, accompanied priests who recorded the number of offerings. It was in the marketplace, where scribes sealed contracts and balances. It entered the palaces, where kings recorded conquests, and it extended to the domestic, where records of family offerings, receipts, and household accounts found their place. It was an intimate and public tool, personal and administrative, ritual and everyday. The inventors of writing were also the inventors of history. A king came to be remembered not only by a tomb, but by the number of years he reigned, the legal norms he issued, the deities he honored, the temples he built, and the campaigns he led. The tablets became the flesh of collective memory, and that memory was the seed that spread Sumer beyond its political end. Because when words remain written, they can be remembered even if those who wrote them disappear. Thanks to them, we know that Gilgamesh existed, even if his unstoppable lament now feels like an archetype. Thanks to them, we understand the value of law before the Code of Hammurabi. Thanks to them, we recover the vitality of Ur, its nocturnal rhythms, its musicians and brewers, its clay kneaded into bread. And thanks to them, the poetry of Inanna and the melancholy of the hero encouraged us to look at the human condition through different eyes. Sumerian writing was also a platform for science. It was the site of the first astronomical calculations, the first calendars, the first eclipse predictions, the first systems of time measurement. It was the Sumerians who observed the stars as messengers, who drew up lists of constellations, and who positioned the seasons in alignment with the cycle of the heavens. They did so for practical reasons. Time and space were needed to manage, but those instruments turned out to be symbolic portals as well. Through the same sign used to record an offering, they recounted the movement of planets. Writing turned knowledge into something that could outlive the body. It allows someone in the 21st century to learn what someone thought in the 22nd century before our era. That continuity is an intangible miracle. A plant growing silently, whose seed was the act of marking soft clay with the tip of a reed stylus. The echo of the Sumerians is in every bound book, in every contract, in every cafe where someone checks a written note. When we leave a word on paper, We exercise an inheritance. When we consult a file, we participate in a past that found refuge in writing. That same technology, which began in Sumer with indented strokes on tablets, now extends toward the digital, toward the virtual. Written memory did not die. It reinvented itself and still bears the mark of those first scribes. But we should not imagine writing as a straight line of progress. There were crises, there were losses. When Ur fell into abandonment and the Sumerian tablets ceased to be read, something faded. But other languages rescued it. Other civilizations adopted and adapted it. Cuneiform passed into Semitic scripts, into Phoenician alphabets, into invisible structures of our heritage. And though its form changed, it carried with it the same fundamental idea. The written word can defy forgetting. Today, when someone looks at a sealed tablet and writes on their phone, there is a secret connection. We may not understand cuneiform. We may be unaware of the name of Ur-Nammu or the priestess Enheduanna, but we are still using the same instrument they once built. We use it to sign contracts, denounce injustices, compose poems, diagnose illnesses, revisit a shopping list, recount a journey. We inherited it from those who held that first piece of clay with unsure hands. Sad, proud, fearful, filled with humanity. That echo is immortal because it lives in us, even though we may not know that its origin lies in the mud of southern Mesopotamia. It is renewed in every letter drawn by a pen on paper, in every text published online, in every message saved to remote storage with a date and time. Writing is a genealogy, and we are, even today, descendants of those scribes who once decided their voice deserved to endure. Perhaps when someone gazes at the moon or reads the name Gilgamesh, they will remember that there was once a time when people were already thinking, already writing, already questioning, with the same urgency we feel today. But their voice, the one pressed into hardened clay, did not wish to be different from ours. It wished to be heard. And it was, across millennia, until now. This video ends, but the story continues. In every open page, in every dialogue, in every contract, the invention of Sumer still lives, and it is our responsibility to sustain it. And so, with the final word etched into a tablet already cold, we close this journey that began in the mud of the rivers and continues to beat in every story we write today. If any of this made you reflect, if you felt the ancient whisper of the Sumerians, you can leave your mark in the comments. There are many more stories waiting to be told, slowly, the way important things should be told. Good night.